if you think for a second the European Union cares about Georgia, you're wrong. If you think the United States cares about Georgia, you're wrong. You're just a chess piece on a map, and we move it around. And you know what happens to pawns? They get taken off the map all the time. And Georgia's job wasn't to become a European nation and a good friend of America. Your job was to sacrifice the Georgian pawn and part of a greater game that we're playing against Russia.
First of all, I'm glad to have you on program. I'm sure a lot of Georgians know you quite well, who are interested in the current conflicts, especially in the Ukrainian conflict. And that's why I'm really very appreciative of your time you joined us. So first of all, we have the quite recent news about some kind of deal between Palestinians and Israelis. So what do you think about that? Because this is really very crucial moment right now, how much it could be settled, because we are facing these two years of really very dramatic military campaign against Palestinian people in Gaza.
Well, first of all, I think we have to look at it from a broad perspective. If you take a look at the heart of the various components of this peace plan, and you compare and contrast them to the demands that Hamas has been, making since October 7th, you'll quickly come to the realization that this is a Hamas peace plan, that this is exactly what Hamas has been asking for from the very beginning. So why now? Hamas is not making any concessions. This means Hamas has won the war. Israel is the one that has to allow things to happen that they said they would never allow. For instance, a Palestinian state. For instance, Hamas being part of a Palestinian government. This is a recognition that Israel could not resolve this issue through military force. Now, Donald Trump deserves credit for bringing this together, but the fact is, the conditions that allowed this to happen weren't conditions that were created by American diplomacy, but Hamas reality. Hamas knew when it initiated this conflict that they were going to be luring Israel into a trap, into Gaza, for the purpose of letting Israel be Israel, meaning that Israel would behave in an egregious fashion, committing genocide, slaughtering Palestinians. And by letting Israel be Israel, Hamas was confident that the world, once they saw the reality of Israel, would reject Israel. And that's what's happened. The world has turned its back on Israel. Nations are recognizing a Palestinian state. International courts are condemning Israeli genocide using that word. This is a tremendous Hamas success. It's coming at a horrific price. And people might say, was it worth it? I don't know. Only the Palestinian people can answer that question. I oftentimes reflect on history, though, and back in 1944, when the British and the Americans were preparing to cross the English Channel and begin the Normandy campaign to liberate France from Nazi Germany, the American and British military planners confronted Charles de Gaulle, the head of the Free French Forces, and they said, if we go into Normandy, we could kill up to 60,000 French civilians. 60,000. That's just the cost of doing business. We have to bomb cities, we have to bomb rail lines, we have to interdict, and a lot of French are going to die. And de Gaulle signed off on this. He said, yes, this is the only way we can liberate France. And while it wasn't 60, I think 20 to 30,000 French civilians died in this campaign, a horrible number. And ever since then, de Gaulle never celebrated the June 6th anniversary because he said that the price was just too heavy, too much burden on his heart. He couldn't celebrate this, but it had to happen. 1,200 Palestinians are going to be released as part of this deal. People who have been held prisoner by the Israelis, people who have been raped by the Israelis, brutalized by the Israelis. And some of them have been in jail for decades. And when they come out, they're going to be going back to a Gaza that's been destroyed from the ground down. And some people would say it's a fair question to say, what are they going back to? And was it worth it? But you have to reflect on the reality. Prior to October 7th, Gaza was an open air concentration camp where Palestinian people were being held prisoner by an Israeli occupier. And because of this deal, if it actually works out, those Palestinian prisoners, when they're released from prison, will be going back to Palestine, to a Palestinian homeland, something they've never had, never experienced. So this is what I think is happening here. This is unprecedented. It's a Hamas victory. It's a victory for American diplomacy, but it's also a recognition on the part of Israel that they lost the war. They lost militarily. They couldn't defeat Hamas. They lost geopolitically. The world turned their back on it. But the most critical defeat that Israel has suffered is the defeat of confidence on the part of the American public. Donald Trump has acknowledged Israel no longer has control of the American Congress like they once had. And support amongst the American people for Israel is slipping, especially amongst the important constituents of the Make America Great Again movement. Because what they've realized for the past months, years, is that Make America Great Again, when it comes to U.S.-Israeli policies, means Israel first, America second. And many Americans have said, no, we're not going to do that. Israel was losing support of the American people. This is why Israel had to take and swallow this bitter poison, because they had no choice. But I think, I hope this works. One never knows, especially in dealing with Israel, who recognizes no red lines and is capable of committing any atrocity. The jury is still out, but there's a greater potential today for peace than there has ever been since this conflict started.
So you said that you hope that it works. So what conditions should be on the ground and should be in the geopolitics to make this peace deal work?
Well, the main thing is Israel has to stop bombing Gaza. Israel has to recognize that there is no military solution, that the day of Israelis killing Palestinians in Gaza, and hopefully the day of the Israelis killing Palestinians in the West Bank, is over, that we are looking for a diplomatic resolution to this problem. Donald Trump has invested a tremendous amount of political capital into this plan. And this plan will only work, however, if Donald Trump is willing to hold Israel accountable for any violations. Yes, of course, we have to hold Hamas accountable for any violations that may take place, but it's Israel that violates the law, Israel that bombed Qatar, Israel that commits genocide, Israel that slaughters Palestinian women and children. This is the Israel that the United States has to bring to heel. And it's up to Donald Trump to do that. This is where Donald Trump earns, his paycheck, not by this deal. This deal was Hamas's deal. Hamas has agreed to it. Donald Trump earns his money by holding Israel's feet to the fire. If Israel can abide by its obligations, then this deal works. But Israel has never shown an ability to abide by any agreement. Israel always acts in a very selfish manner and chooses violence over diplomacy. So that's why I've caveated. I'm hopeful, but I'm not certain.
What do you think about Trump personally? Is it the next step towards the Nobel Peace Prize?
That's up to the Nobel Committee, not me. I personally think that anybody who lobbies for, I come from a military culture. Um, if you were awarded a medal, it's because you did your job and your bosses, your commanding officers determined that your job was done to a degree that warranted recognition. You don't get a medal just for doing your job. You get a paycheck. You get trained, you get a paycheck, you get a pat on the back, you get promoted. But when they put a medal on you, that means you have done something worthy of distinction. But you don't lobby for it. Any military officer that lobbies for a medal should be kicked out of the military. And maybe as the commander-in-chief of the American Armed Forces, Donald Trump should take a lesson from this protocol. If you want the Nobel Peace Prize, do something to earn it. Do something so great and wonderful that the Nobel Committee has no choice but to recognize your accomplishments. But to lobby for it, to say, I deserve the Nobel Peace Prize, That's unbecoming.
Okay, so let's move to another topic, which is also shows how contradictory is some policies, which is for the United States, for instance. I would like to ask you about the Venezuela's case, because it is also a very complicated story. Because so we are facing that the second boat was shot recently, and allegedly the drug vessel was it was a drug dealing vessel, and etc. So. On the other hand, there are a lot of claims that the United States is going to replace President Maduro of Venezuela. What do you think? What is the end game for the United States regarding the Venezuela? Because sometimes it really looks like the kind of Iraqi campaign, because in Iraqi they replace it Saddam Hussein mostly to control the Iraqi oil. Maybe this is also the replacing Maduro because of controlling the Venezuela oil.
Well, yes, I think if Venezuela didn't have all of our oil under their soil, there wouldn't be a problem. But shame on Venezuela for having all that American oil under their soil. And shame on Iraq for having American oil under its soil, and Libya for having American oil under its soil, and Syria for whatever, it has some American oil down there too. We stole that for a while. Um, Look, the United States has been not just behaving as a global hegemon, but we were the undisputed global hegemon for many decades. And therefore, what the United States wanted, the United States got, generally speaking. Um, not always. We wanted Saddam Hussein gone, he's gone. We wanted Muammar Gaddafi gone, he's gone. We wanted Bashar al-Assad gone, he's gone. We wanted Manuel Noriega in Panama gone, he's gone, died in an American prison. But we also want the Iranian theocracy gone, they're still there. We wanted Vladimir Putin gone, he's still there. So we don't always get what we want. But generally speaking, if you're a nation that lacks significant military capabilities and the United States puts their target on you, it's not going to end up well for you. It doesn't guarantee, an American victory. Just look at Iraq, look at Libya. Libya is a disaster. Look at Syria, the humiliation of having to shake hands with Jolani, an Al-Qaeda terrorist who has the blood of Americans on their hands. But the goal was to get rid of Bashar al-Assad. The goal in Venezuela is to get rid of Nicolas Maduro. And I believe we will accomplish this goal. That doesn't mean there will be an American victory. My concern is once we remove Maduro, we'll have unleashed forces in Venezuela that create instability for some time now, not just in Venezuela, but regionally. And that we'll end up with a Libya type situation, in our own backyard, which is the last thing we want, you see, because what's really driving this is the Monroe Doctrine. I don't know if your audience is familiar with the Monroe Doctrine, but, it's a 19th century concept that says that the Western Hemisphere is an American hemisphere, and no European power, foreign power is allowed to come in and play in our backyard, that we alone get to dictate the outcome. And Donald Trump has made it clear that he is implementing the Monroe Doctrine 2.0, and Venezuela is going to be one of the, premier cases of how this implementation will go. I believe that as we speak, the Central Intelligence Agency is working very hard with Maduro's neighbors, with elements inside Venezuela. The five families that have ruled for so long, the power elites are very pro-American, and we are creating a political alternative. We will destabilize Maduro economically, politically. And then we will paint him with the modern day equivalent of weapons of mass destruction. What we painted Saddam Hussein with, Muammar Gaddafi with. This is narco trafficking. We've accused Maduro of being a narco trafficker. We've accused his government of being a narco trafficking government. There is an indictment that has been put forward in the Southern District of New York. And that allows us to say that this is a criminal. He's not the legitimate leader of Venezuela. He's a criminal indicted under American law who is escaping justice. He's a fugitive from justice. These are the exact words that Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, has used. And I believe that we are going to be launching a concerted effort to get rid of Maduro using American military power and then also the covert capabilities of the Central Intelligence Agency, and that eventually Maduro will either be killed, flee the country, or be taken prisoner and die in an American prison, just like Manuel Noriega did.
So, what do you think? Is that kind of the new endless war, like the Afghanistan or Iraq, as we spoke about that? So, is United States ready for this kind of military campaign?
Yes, we can fight wars. We don't always win wars, but we can go to war. We have a very powerful military, a very capable military, and Venezuela doesn't have a powerful military. Look, Manuel Noriega in Panama was able to muster a lot of militias too. He handed weapons out to Panamanians. Study what happened in 1989, the mass murder we committed against the Palestinian or the Panamanians who rose up against us. We burned an entire suburb of Panama City to the ground. Um, if we make, we're heartless. Ask the citizens of Mosul what it was like to have the United States bomb your city in an effort to drive ISIS out of that city. We destroyed that city. Ask the citizens of Raqqa in Syria what it was like when America decides that they're going to evict people. We will have no qualms about destroying Caracas or destroying any Venezuelan city necessary. We will destroy the infrastructure necessary. We're very good at this. It's a very bad thing we're doing. I'm not proud of this. But if you think for a second the United States will hesitate to use lethal force to slaughter civilians by the hundreds of thousands to achieve a geopolitical outcome, you don't know the United States.
Yeah, but how much does it fit with the peacemaker icon which Donald Trump is trying to build about himself? Is it fitted to each other?
Logically, no. I mean,
What in
anybody
that
who
case, what does it mean for the internal society? I mean, from one hand, Donald Trump is trying to show himself like the biggest peacemaker, like he ended 7 conflict. Now he's ending the 8th one, and now he's starting the new war, new Afghanistan or new Iraqi-like war in Venezuela.
Venezuela won't be the new Afghanistan. I mean, come on. Afghanistan had a different history. Um, you're dealing with Pashtun tribes in mountain areas that have a base of support in Pakistan. Um, Venezuela is not Afghanistan. There's jungles out there, but we know how to fight in jungles. Um, where is Venezuela going to get its lifeline? Is China going to be flying in airplanes? No. Is Russia going to be sending in the Navy? No. Cuba may send some forces, but we can interdict that. We have a very powerful Navy. So Venezuela will be isolated, and we will use Venezuelan forces against the Venezuelan people. We may not win. It may become a quagmire like Libya. But Libya is one where we have Libyans fighting Libyans. We have other proxies, and we will use proxies. We will use Colombian proxies. We will use Brazilian proxies. The CIA is very clever in this way. So Argentina will do anything for us, and so we can get Argentinian troops involved. Um, but what this definitely shows is that we're not peacemakers. A peacemaker there is a deal to be made with Nicolas Maduro that could turn Venezuela into an American resource. We can make that deal today. But that doesn't lend itself to the image that Donald Trump's trying to portray. You see, peace through strength requires a recognition of the reality of American strength. And so I think one of the goals that he has in flexing his muscles in Venezuela is to demonstrate that America has a military capable of decisive intervention and achieving discernible outcomes. There's no guarantee he's going to get that, but also I think we have to understand that Venezuela is part and parcel of a new transition to a national security strategy that disentangles the United States from Europe, from Asia, and instead has us focusing on defending Fortress America, securing our domination of the Western Hemisphere, both North and South America and Central America in between. This is the strategic objective of the Trump administration, is to create Fortress America. This is why you hear the talk about Greenland, you hear the talk about Panama. These are essential items for the United States to secure this American bastion of power. And so I think this is the direction we're heading. But if you're looking for um, logic between trying to cast oneself as a peacemaker while promoting war, there is no logic whatsoever.
Finally, what do you think about that? Is that decision about Venezuela is already done? Is already
Yeah, no, the decision's already been made. The president signed off on what's called a presidential finding, usually a top secret document that he signs together with the national security advisor, who is dual-hatted as a Secretary of State. A very bad situation, similar to what happened with Henry Kissinger under Nixon and Ford. Eventually, Kissinger had to drop um, one of those hats because it's unconstitutional. It just doesn't work. But his national security advisor is Marco Rubio, who has been gunning for Maduro for some time now. There's no doubt in my mind that a presidential finding has been signed that the CIA has been given full authority to carry out a whole range of covert actions, and that the military has been put on notice to be prepared to close with and destroy the Venezuelan enemy through firepower and maneuver. Um, we will pick the time and place when we want to strike, but when we do, it will be decisive. And I don't believe that Nicolas Maduro will survive as the president of Venezuela.
so. Let me ask you about another contradictory positions of Donald Trump regarding the Ukrainian conflict. So, on one day, we remember how his attitude was regarding the Zelensky's and about Putin, and he sometimes after another he's disappointing with Vladimir Putin and etc. Now, he announced a couple of days ago that he has already made for himself the decision about the Tomahawks, but he's expecting some kind of explanations from the Ukrainian side for what they're gonna use them, and this will make final decision for him. So, what do you think about that? Is he ready really to give the Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine?
I don't know. He says he is, but we have to deal with reality. First of all, we need to understand this, that Donald Trump has dug himself into a hole here. I mean, he created artificially inflated expectations from the start on his ability to bring it into this conflict. He said he could solve it by a phone call. Well, he could, but the phone call would have to be to Zelensky and telling Zelensky the reality America would walk away from this conflict. But that's not what Donald Trump wanted. He wanted, because Donald Trump is not advised by people who know anything about Russia. This is a very important point that needs to be made. The Russophobes, the people who hate Russia, who've hated Russia for some time now, dominate the inner circle around Donald Trump. And they aren't looking for peace with Russia. They're looking for the United States to solidify a geopolitical reality that has America, emerging as the dominant force in Europe as we disengage from Europe. We leave Europe on our terms. The last thing these Russophobes will permit is the perception or the reality of a Russian victory in Ukraine. This is why they speak of a frozen conflict. They want a North Korean type situation, something that will tie Russia down for decades, drain its strength, its economic strength, etc., weaken the hold on power that Vladimir Putin has, and try to ensure, and this is the ultimate objective, to ensure that whoever replaces Vladimir Putin will be somebody more like Boris Yeltsin than like Dmitry Medvedev. So this is the goal and objective here. Donald Trump thought that he knew Russia. He's been getting horrible advice, again, from Keith Kellogg, his special envoy for Ukraine, from Marco Rubio, who's a Russophobe. John Ratcliffe, his CIA director, is a Russophobe. Pete Hegseth is a Russophobe. J.D. Vance is ambivalent, but he's sort of being outvoted. And Tulsi Gabbard, she's focused on other issues. But Scott Bessent, the Secretary of Treasury, definitely is a Russophobe. So they're all telling Trump that Russia's weak, that Putin's hold on power isn't as strong as it appears, that if you put certain pressures on Russia, Putin will have no choice but to back down and to concede, to make concessions, to seek peace on terms that would be politically acceptable to Donald Trump. This is what he was told. If you engage Russia, these are the behaviors that will lead to guaranteed Russian reactions. But because they don't know anything about Russia, they don't understand how Russia works, they don't understand how Vladimir Putin works, how the Russian government works, they've misread Russia from the very beginning. Russia doesn't back down. Russia doesn't retreat on a whim. Russia has a plan, they have a goal, they have an objective, and they are committed to this, and they've been articulate about what they want, and they haven't deviated from this one iota. but we in the West don't know how to read Russia. And so things that are happening between Russia and Ukraine, because they're not happening on a timeline that we want, this fast timeline, we say, oh, Russia's weak. Russia's not winning. And therefore, this weakness leads to political problems. The fact is, Russia's not weak. Russia is winning, but they're winning on a timeline that they want. This is incompatible with how Donald Trump viewed the problem, and he became frustrated. And the frustration is borne out by his actions on Ukraine. In many ways, his behavior is that of a child throwing a temper tantrum. Didn't get their way, so they're pouting, they're yelling, they're screaming, and they're trying to break everything. But I think that's also cover, because Donald Trump's not a stupid man. He is unconventional in the extreme. There's no doubt about that. But he is not looking for a third world war with Russia. What he's looking for is a politically safe mechanism for disengaging from Europe. Not just walking away from Europe, because that would be politically difficult, but to create the conditions so that if Ukraine fails, the failure will be Europe's, not America's. And so he says some things that people, they take at face value. Don't take anything Donald Trump says about Ukraine and Russia at face value. For instance, he told Zelensky in their meeting in New York, you can go and go back to the 1991 borders. Hell, go on to Moscow if you want to. Do it. Win the war. You got this. And Zelensky's smiling, saying, wow, America's behind me now. But then he said, yeah, we're not going to be selling any weapons. We'll let NATO buy weapons, and NATO can do with what they want. But no, we're done. And it was Kelly Kallas, the foreign policy person of the European Union, who woke up to this, and she acknowledged that Donald Trump has washed his hands of the Ukrainian conflict, and that he's put the burden on Europe, and Europe can't do the job, and they are desperate right now. So now we come to the Tomahawk decision. Before we get to the Tomahawk decision, let's look at two things that predate that. First of all, Donald Trump's statement that if you're on the defensive, you can't win a war. That in order to win the war, you've got to go on the offensive. You have to have the ability, you have to have weapons capable of striking the enemy deep, and that Ukraine didn't have these weapons. So the first thing we saw was a contract for what's called the ERAM, the Extended Range Attack Missile. Wall Street Journal talked about 3,200 of these being sold to Ukraine. And I mean, everybody's like, well, this is a game changer. I mean, 3,200, that's a lot of missiles. But nobody reads the small print. The contractors involved, there's only one contract that's been signed. It's a $34 million contract for the delivery of a single prototype weapon this month in October. So the 3,200 missiles, they don't exist. They haven't been built yet. There's not even a factory to build them yet. There's a single prototype missile that's being evaluated. And once it passes muster, then procurement begins, where they build the factory, hire the people, hire the machinery, and begin to produce the missiles. Once missile production gets up, maximum output is 1,000 missiles a year. So even if they had the factories today and they started producing missiles today, and they don't, and they're not, you wouldn't get 3,200 missiles until 3.2 years down the road. That's the reality. Headlines talk about one thing, but the reality is something different. Now we come to the Tomahawk. Trump says he's made a decision. Decision conforms with what we already talked about, the desire to create the perception that Ukraine, in order to be able to win this war, has to be able to strike Russia, and they need the weapons to do that. But we also have to look at reality. Trump has never said the United States will provide Tomahawks directly to Ukraine. In fact, he said the exact opposite. We will sell these Tomahawks to a European intermediary, a NATO intermediary, and then they will transfer these weapons to Ukraine. Right now, there's only two European nations that use the Tomahawk. One is Great Britain, and their Tomahawk is an advanced model like the Americans that uses advanced cryptology and American-provided intelligence that isn't transferable to Ukraine under any circumstances. The other nation is the Dutch. They, I think in 2018-19, said they won the Tomahawk. In 2023, they put forward a contract that called for testing. They fired a couple of them out of the various Dutch ships. And in April of this year, they began letting out contracts to procure the Tomahawk. and they will buy a couple hundred of them that are delivered in 2028. 2028, that's 3 years from now. If that's the contract vehicle, then Ukraine couldn't expect to see a Tomahawk until 2028 at the earliest. Now, Trump is talking about, accelerating this. Maybe a handful will go. He said, we'll get a few of them to Ukraine. That's what the Ukrainian defense ministry said. A few will be given to us. Then Trump says, you won't use them against Russia initially. You're just going to fire them inside, which means why give them a Tomahawk? It goes 1,500 miles. And if you're only going to fire at a range of 200 miles, sort of a waste of time and effort. But even then, how do they do this? The Tomahawks that the Netherlands are buying are sea-launched Tomahawks. They fire from a Mark 41 Aegis system. We know that Aegis can be brought ashore. We've seen that in Romania. We've seen that in Poland. Both of those are capable of firing Tomahawk missiles. But only two Aegis-Asaurus systems exist outside of the Polish and the Romanian systems, the ground versions, and the United States has both of those. Netherlands doesn't have any. How does Ukraine get this? They can't build their own, so one is going to have to be provided to them. They don't exist. The United States isn't going to give up 50% of its capability to give the Ukrainians a Tomahawk, a ground-launched Tomahawk. What system are they going to get? It's going to be a dumbed-down system. I mean, a really stupid system because it can't use the American cryptology. They can't use the American targeting systems. The Russians already have the best Tomahawk America produced. If you remember in 2017, I believe Donald Trump fired 60 Tomahawks against Syrian sites. Most of them didn't make it. They were shot down or down through electronic warfare, and several of them fell into Syrian fields intact. And the Russians got these, and they've taken them apart and studied them. This is why Vladimir Putin was very confident. We said, we know this system. It's not very good, and we can shoot it down. So they're not panicked about it. But even then, the Ukrainians just aren't going to get these. I mean, where are these missiles? How do the Ukrainians get them? How do they fire them? How do they get them to the front line? Something happened just this week. I don't think people have put two and two together. The Russians have been criticized for some time now, and you see this. Gilbert Doctorow is a big critic out there, and others that Vladimir Putin is actually weak. They parsed out the Valdai Club speech that he gave last week and said this was a sign of weakness. This man is weak. He's apologetic to Trump. He's out of touch with the general staff. There could be a coup, that Russia's susceptible to a coup. And I'm like, well, never in the history of anything has a leader who enjoys 80% support been overthrown by a coup. And Vladimir Putin's one of the most popular presidents the Russians have ever had. But it also means that you don't understand how Russians think. You see, a lot of people have been critical of the Russians, myself included, early on in the war, before I started to put on my Russia hat and said, maybe there's a different way to look at this. But why did Russia allow NATO to send all these weapons into Ukraine and not blow up the trains, not blow up the bridges, not blow up the tunnels? Why did they let that happen? Well, because if they had blown up all these things, then the logistical base of support would have been built in NATO countries. And you can't bomb that without going to war with NATO. So now you make your job harder. But by letting NATO believe that Western Ukraine was a safe haven, allowing the Ukrainians to operate as if they could operate without any consequences, the transfer of hundreds of billions of dollars of military equipment wasn't just out from NATO to Ukraine. They built the facilities in Ukraine to receive these weapons. They built factories to build these weapons. And last week, Russia started destroying them. It turns out there is no defense. Russia has solved the Patriot problem, 6% intercept rate. And all of the factories that NATO built in Ukraine are destroyed. And all of the warehouses that held these weapons are gone. And the trains that move them are being hit. Russia waited until NATO fully committed to the Western Ukraine strategy and then destroyed it. Now there's no plan B. Where are these Tomahawks going to go? They can't go into Western Ukraine because they'll be destroyed. I mean, the Russians haven't answered everything. So I think Donald Trump is talking about Tomahawks in an effort to put pressure on Russia, but I don't believe that Tomahawks will ever be manifested in reality. I don't think that this will happen. As we speak, Russia is in total control of the battlefield. They're pushing the Ukrainian army back. They're slaughtering the Ukrainian soldiers. They're destroying the Ukrainian economy. And the Tomahawk, I think, was just Donald Trump talking big, like he did with the ERAM, like he does with everything. But the reality is that the Russian reality beats the fiction of Donald Trump's brain.
So, but yes, and again, there is another contradictory issue regarding the START treaty, which Trump agreed to prolong after its ends in 2026. So how much does it fit with the giving the Tomahawk missiles on one hand, on the other hand, to agree with the negotiations regarding the START treaty, and what really START treaty means between in relations of the U.S. and Russia?
Well, I mean, this is it's a very complicated. I could write a PhD thesis on this subject, in fact. So I'll try not to bore your audience, but the fact is, the New START Treaty, which was signed in 2010, is a derivative of START, START 2, START 3, and then another treaty thrown in the middle called SORT. We've been doing strategic arms reductions for some time now, since the end of the Cold War. And New START is the latest manifestation of that. It caps the respective deployed strategic nuclear arsenals of both the United States and Russia, 1,550 systems per country. And that worked when New START was signed in 2010. One of the things that's happened is because of America's posture in the Pacific, aggressive posture in support of Taiwan, is that there's been the concern about a potential conflict between the United States and China. And every time the United States war games out a potential conflict against China over Taiwan, we lose. And what happens is we end up having to go to nuclear weapons. And the Chinese were following this, so they began to modernize their nuclear force, to bring in new weapons, to increase the numbers so that they have survivability. And last year, the Biden administration published a new nuclear employment guidance document, very highly classified document. But it said we have to reconfigure our targeting of our nuclear weapons. We can't just go against the Russians. We have to start targeting the Chinese, but we have problems with 1,550 because now, Russia and the United States have parity. How do we deter Russia and have a potential war-winning nuclear capability against Russia and deal with the Chinese as well? And so they went with a more aggressive first strike policy against China. And this has caused the Chinese to react. They've redone their nuclear doctrine. It used to be, assured retaliation, meaning that their force was small but survivable. And if they were hit, they had assured retaliation. But now, under Biden, we went to a preemptive strike to take out that assured retaliation. So the Chinese, while they're modernizing their force, went to launch on warning. That means if they detect a launch, they're not going to wait for it to hit. They're going to go ahead and launch everything. Again, very dangerous posture. But while they're doing this, they're building up their nuclear arsenal. Today, they went from 200 to 300 nuclear warheads to now 500 to 600. By 2030, there's talk that they'll be up to 1,500. So now you're in the United States, and New START caps you at 1,550. You got the Russians at 1,550, and you got the Chinese coming up to 1,500. Is New START suddenly a good treaty for the United States? The answer is no. And so there's an inclination on the part of the United States to let this treaty expire so that we can overnight, because I understand, I'll give you an example. The Minuteman III missile, which is the cornerstone of our land-based deterrent, it is our land-based deterrent. 450 of these missiles, they were designed to carry 3 independently targeted nuclear warheads. But because of New START and the limitations, we downloaded them to 1. So 450 equals 450 warheads. If New START goes away, we will overnight put 3 warheads back on top of each missile. That means we go from 450 to, forgive my Marine Corps math, but I think it's 1,350 overnight. The same thing with our Trident missiles in our Ohio-class submarines. we got rid of certain silos, or the tubes, launch tubes, but we didn't destroy them. They can be brought up immediately. The Trident missiles we can increase the number of missiles per submarine. And like the Minuteman, the Trident had its warheads reduced. The number's classified, so I'm not even going to pretend to speculate, but we're talking a 40% increase in capability, which will take the number of warheads up. So we will quadruple or quintuple the number of deployed nuclear warheads within weeks of New START expiring. And there's Americans that say this is a good thing. This gets America to where we need to be so we can take care of China and Russia at the same time. But there's other people that say this begins an arms race that we can't win. In fact, because we've already lost the arms race. You see, because when we withdrew from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, a 1972 foundational agreement that created the concept of mutually assured destruction, that means that nuclear wars should never be fought because you can't win a nuclear war, so don't even try. But now with missile defense, we believe that we can build a defense against their missiles, which makes our missiles survivable. We can win a nuclear war. So we withdrew from the ABM treaty, and the Russians warned us. They said, don't do that. This is very destabilizing. If you begin to deploy a new ballistic missile defense shield, we'll have to respond. And they have. Today, Russia has completely new nuclear delivery systems. I mean, the Sarmat missile, heavy ICBM, is being fielded now. It doesn't come at us over the North Pole where we have all our early warning, our satellites. It comes at us from the South Pole where we got nothing. Meaning when they launch it, it's going to hit us. We won't know it. And there's nothing we can do to stop it. They have the Yars missile and the Topol M that have this new hypersonic warhead, the Avant-Garde, that can't be shot down. They have the Oreshnik now because we withdrew from the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. They have new Iskander S, 1,000-mile range Iskander, because we withdrew from the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. They have new submarines, new submarine missiles, new warhead designs. They have done everything that we haven't done. In the United States, we were talking about replacing our Minuteman III with this new missile called the Sentinel, but we can't build it. It's too expensive. We stopped developing it because Congress went, I mean, when they first announced it, I forget, they were talking about $400 billion over 10 years. And I looked at the system based upon what I know about our defense industry. I said, that's $1 trillion system and it will never work. And that's what happened. It started becoming this very expensive system that wasn't going to work. So Congress killed it. And now we're going to modernize our Minuteman III system to keep it viable up until 2050. The missile's already older than the men and women who were called upon to launch it. And soon it'll be older than their grandparents. That's the reality of the American system. We don't want to enter into a nuclear arms race against either Russia or China, both of who are building modern missiles today that work. The Chinese, the DF-41, is an advanced solid rocket fuel missile that's going into silos in Western China. We don't have a defense against that. They have more advanced versions coming out, DF-61, which will bring in hypersonic warheads that we can't defend against. If we want to get involved in an arms race and we lift the caps on our missiles, the caps are lifted on everybody else as well. And we're going to see an arms race, an explosion, where not only will we not enjoy quantitative advantages, but qualitatively we'll be inferior to everything the Russians and the Chinese have. And hopefully somebody whispered this in Donald Trump's ear, because twice when he was asked about New START, once in July and once recently, in July he said, oh, we can't let that treaty expire. Well, it's expiring. But when Vladimir Putin offered a 1-year moratorium on the caps to buy time to negotiate, Trump said, yeah, that's a good idea. Sounds like a good idea. But now how is he going to negotiate? You see, Donald Trump, on July 25th, he said he can't let the treaty expire. But on July 19th, he allowed Marco Rubio to cut 1,300 jobs from the State Department. These are the people that do the negotiations, that are the Russian experts, the arms control experts. Fired them all. They're gone. And the offices that are responsible for this no longer have arms control as their number one priority. In fact, the office that did arms control now has 2 other jobs: counterterrorism, which is a very important job, and counter narcotics, which is Venezuela, which we talked about. You think arms control is number one priority? No. There's no one in Washington, D.C. right now working forward on arms control. The Russian ambassador to the United Nations, talking about, how the United Nations could get involved in disarmament. He said there's a vacuum. Nobody, The United States not even talking about it. In the past, they would at least whisper it. The Chinese and Americans stopped their arms control discussions last year, and they haven't resumed them yet because there's nobody to resume them. We fired them all. I'm an old arms control guy. I did this for a living. Um, I will say that when I began this job in 1987, 1988, um, arms control was theoretical. The Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty was the first time it became real practical. I'm one of the guys that wrote the book on how to do arms control verification using on-site inspection, how to do other things. It is hard work. The people that helped save the world from nuclear weapons back in the 1980s and 1990s, people like me, I was young back then. I was like 29, 30 years old when I was doing this job. Paul Nietzsche, the guy who negotiated the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, he's dead. Jack Matlock, the ambassador to the Soviet Union, he's in his 90s. My bosses, the colonels who were my bosses in Russia, they're dead. And there's nobody to replace them. We're not training a new generation of arms control specialists. So even if the president wanted to take advantage of this one-year moratorium, he's not. But let's just say for a second that we found some arms control people and the president said, okay, we need to save this thing. We need to negotiate a new treaty. What do you do about Tomahawk missiles? Because the Russians have said if you give Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, it's over. We're done. It's finished. What about Golden Dome? That missile defense shield. The Russians have said you can't have Golden Dome and talk about New START. If you put Golden Dome in, the New START goes away and we build even more missiles. Donald Trump hasn't backed away from Tomahawk. And on Golden Dome, they just let a $150 billion contract. Now, the good news is, again, I said, always look into the details, look past the headlines. The contract is 10 years, and it doesn't require people to do anything. Literally, read the contract. You don't have to build anything. You don't have to deliver anything. You just have to think about it. And they're going to get paid $15 billion a year for 10 years. And at the end of 10 years, the thought is they're going to have a finished product. But if they don't, there's no consequences. It's a boondoggle. It's literally a scam. It's crime. So there won't be a Golden Dome system. And that's the good news, because then it doesn't kill arms control. But Trump needs to have his words start matching reality. He needs to tell the Russians, I'm not sending Tomahawks to Ukraine because that's destabilizing. And I'm not going to build Golden Dome because that's destabilizing. I want to focus on making arms control irrelevant again. I want to focus on saving this New START treaty. Right now, he's just not focused on it. And I'm very afraid that this opportunity is going to be passed and the world's going to find itself in a nuclear arms race. And for the citizens of Georgia, just so you understand what this means, you die. Now, you don't get a vote. You don't get to have, nobody's calling you up saying, how do you feel about this? But I'm here to tell you right now, if there's a nuclear war between Russia and the United States, you're dead, every single one of you. No one will survive. So it matters. And for all the people out there that hate Russia, Russia's your best friend right now. And maybe you might want to call up Vladimir Putin and say, from the Georgian perspective, in case you want to hear, we like this treaty. We think it's a good treaty. And maybe you want to call up the United States and say, hey, we're Georgia. Remember Megalbari Act? You guys pretend to be our friends. Why don't you really be our friends and not get into a nuclear arms race with Russia? Because if it goes bad, we all die, and we don't want to die. This is the reality for Georgia.
Let me ask you about Georgia for our summarizing our conversation. And thank you so much for these insights, because it was really, really very fascinating. And I would like to prolong a lot of talks about you touched right now, but I would like to ask about Georgia. So you probably know that recently we had the elections, so it was the local elections. And also there was another, let's so-called attempt on the coup. So this was a kind of, since the war started in Ukraine, a lot of tensions between Georgian and EU government and the US government as well has arisen. And a lot of pressure is coming from the Western side towards the Georgian government. What do you think is the main goal for this pressure? I mean, we see that they are trying to replace the local government here. But what is the main reason for this replacement? What is the real reason behind this aim? What is your thoughts about that?
I got to be careful how I how I answer this because my wife is Georgian and we have family in Georgia, and my daughter, both daughters speak Georgian. My wife's family, or her parents, lived with us for many years and raised my children. And one of my daughters spent 2.5 years in Georgia as a member of the Peace Corps. And Georgia is very much in the hearts of my family. We think about Georgia every day. Um, and I don't want to get anybody mad, because I love Georgia. I love Georgian people. But that's where I want to start. Is when I look at Georgia, I see a nation full of Georgian people who are complicated. I mean, you got Mingrelians, and you got guys from Khetheti, you got Abkhazians, you got Ossetians, you got all the different things. The Svans. I mean, it's wonderful. This wonderful mixture of people that make Georgian culture what it is. I mean, you can't just have Khachapuri. You can have Mingrelian Khachapuri, or you can have Adjarian Khachapuri. I mean, Georgia is wonderful place. The proper way to eat kinkhali is very important. And I'm not being superficial here. What I'm trying to say is Georgia is populated by human beings, by Georgians who love their country. Um, and if you're going to speak about Georgia in a geopolitical sense, and you don't start with that reality, then what happens is Georgia just becomes a chess piece on a giant chessboard that people are moving it around and they don't care about the Georgian people. So this this is also where I get into some trouble here because I'm a student of Georgian history. I've actually studied Georgian history quite extensively, almost as much as I've studied Russian history, which is my specialty. But I think that the Georgians went through a very difficult period of time. The transitioning from Soviet Georgia to the modern Georgian Republic was not an easy transition. We know that Georgia lost two territories, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, because of conflicts that come from that period of time. And we know that there was economic difficulty. A lot of Americans don't understand the civil war that existed between Gamsarkudia and Shevardnadze. I don't even think many Georgians realize the only reason why Shevardnadze won that war is because the Russians landed troops in Poti and fought on behalf of Georgia to defeat Gamsarkudia and the rebels. People don't want to talk about these complexities that Gamsarkudia fled to Chechnya and was a friend of Dudayev. Before Shamil Basayev brought the Chechens down to fight in Gagra and such. It's very complicated, but I also think that at that time, Georgians didn't know what Georgia was, and they fell out of love with Georgia, and they became addicted to this notion that Georgia was a European nation. And so they wanted Georgia to be European. They wanted Georgia to be European very badly. They wanted Georgia to be pro-American. And therefore, that meant that Georgia had to be NATO. So they bought into these concepts of NATO membership and membership in the EU. And this is what defined Georgia. Georgia is a European nation. Georgia is part of the EU. But notice what's happening there. Georgia has now become European, not Georgian. Georgians forgot what it was like to be Georgian, what it meant to be Georgian. And they sold their soul to people who don't care about Georgia. If you think for a second the European Union cares about Georgia, you're wrong. If you think the United States cares about Georgia, you're wrong. You're just a chess piece on a map, and we move it around. And you know what happens to pawns? They get taken off the map all the time. And Georgia's job wasn't to become a European nation and a good friend of America. Your job was to sacrifice the Georgian pawn in part of a greater game that we're playing against Russia. Georgia's job was to open up a second front against Russia. Your job was to die. And see, as somebody who loves Georgia and loves Georgians, I don't like that. I don't like that outcome. I respect Georgia enough to say that Georgia is a Georgian nation populated by a Georgian people who don't define themselves as being European and NATO. You define yourselves as being Georgian, and therefore you have to look at a Georgian reality. And the reality is that Georgia's best friend speaks Russian, not English, not French, not German, Russian. Your best friend is your neighbor to the north because that best friend cares about you because what happens to Georgia happens to Russia. You're linked. You're linked historically, you're linked geographically, you're linked economically. And yet your European and American friends are telling you no, to turn your back on your Russian neighbor, to become an enemy of the Russian neighbor, knowing that the outcome of being an enemy with Russia is the death of Georgia. But we're willing to sacrifice Georgia for the greater objective. We're willing to sacrifice the Georgian pawn so that we can move the Ukrainian knight into place. As a friend of Georgia, as somebody who has a Georgian wife and a family in Georgia, friends in Georgia, I'm not satisfied with that. And neither is the Georgian government of Georgia Dream Party. I mean, I've been amazed at the strategic thinking of Georgia Dream. I've been watching them. I was taken aback early on when Georgia Dream first came in when Bidzina Ivanishvili was the president. And one of the things they did was have that constitutional change to say that constitutionally Georgia has to be part of the European Union and part of NATO. And I'm like, whoa, that's going to cause some problems. But in retrospect, I look back on it and I say that was a brilliant move because saying that you have to become part of European Union and NATO and actually becoming part of the European Union and NATO are two totally different things. But what it did is it bought Georgia time to transition away from the difficult period of Saakashvili. Remember what preceded Ivanishvili becoming president was Saakashvili's term as president. This is the man that got you into that war in 2008. The Georgian Dream government has come out and published a report that says this was Saakashvili's fault. And we know the history of it. We know what, the American Secretary of State came, whispered sweet nothing in his ears, made promises that couldn't be kept. The Georgian army got mobilized, sent into South Ossetia, and the result is history. You lost South Ossetia and you lost Abkhazia in its totality. When I read about the platform of Georgia Dream, the thing that impressed me was that they weren't in the business of losing more Georgian territory. They were in the business of bringing Abkhazia back to Georgia. And since my wife is from Sukhumi, since her parents were evicted from Sukhumi, and since all of her childhood friends had to flee Sukhumi, getting Sukhumi back means a lot to my wife. And if anybody has ever been married to a Georgian woman, what's important to a Georgian wife is important to the husband, or else the marriage is not a happy marriage. And so getting Sukhumi back is a top priority, getting Abkhazia back. But how do you do it? You can't do it by force. Joining NATO will not bring it back. In fact, Abkhazia is the poison pill. Georgia will never be able to join NATO as long as Abkhazia is not part of Georgia. And by seeking to join NATO, you guarantee that Russia will never allow Abkhazia and South Ossetia to be returned to Georgia. So this created this perpetual, death spiral that Georgia could never recover from. But Ivanishvili understood, given the extreme pro-Western trends that were, popular in Georgia, that if he came in up front and said, oh no, we're not going to be part of the European Union, we're not going to be part of NATO, we're going to be closely aligned economically and politically with Russia, that would be the end of him politically, because Georgia wasn't ready for that. It took time. My daughter, as I said, was in the Peace Corps. She was in Gori, near Gori, a town near Gori. Gori, of course, had been occupied by Russian soldiers in 2008, and she, lived in a family who the husband fought in that conflict, and they lived under Russian occupation, and there's a lot of bitterness there. That's the reality. There's a lot of Russians or a lot of Georgians that are bitter about Russia, about what happened in Abkhazia, South Ossetia, happened in 2008. But this was Saakashvili's war. How do you recover from this? How do you emerge from this? The United States took advantage of this, and Europe took advantage of this by bringing in these non-governmental organizations to carry out a regime change. We decided the Georgia Dream was not compatible for our vision. We wanted a more activist government. We wanted a government that wasn't concerned about preserving Georgia, but willing to sacrifice Georgia. And so we brought in these non-governmental organizations paid with USAID money, United States Agency of International Development, money supervised by the National Endowment of Democracy, which was created in 1986 to do the work of the CIA. All the work that NED does used to be done by the CIA to achieve regime change. But they said, oh, that's too controversial. We'll just pretend that it's not regime change. But it's regime change. Everything the United States and Europe did in Georgia was about getting rid of Georgia Dream, to replace Georgia Dream with a government to be willing to go to war against Russia to help out Ukraine. What the Georgia Dream government did was genius. I watched it. To float the foreign agent registration law. When they first floated it, they withdrew it, and everybody said, look how weak Georgia Dream is. They're not weak. They floated the law, and then they watched and saw who did what, how they responded. Then they pulled the law back. They got their act together, and next time they put the law forward, they knew what had to do to make it law and how to survive that. It's a good law. The Foreign Agent Registration Act is not a Russian law. It's a pro-Georgian law, because you need to understand that USAID wasn't about helping Georgians. It was about destroying Georgia. The National Endowment for Democracy wasn't about helping Georgia. It was about destroying Georgia, about removing Georgia Dream, replacing with a government that would be willing to send Georgia to war against Russia, knowing that Georgia would be destroyed. But that's okay, because you were a pawn to be sacrificed. And Georgia Dream wasn't willing to be that pawn. So they passed this law. Now they're dealing with the consequences of that. A lot of money was put into Georgia. Now, I believe in democracy and I believe in freedom of speech. And I honestly believe that there are many Georgians who feel strongly about their opposition to Georgia Dream. It's not against the law in my book to be politically opposed to Georgia Dream. Just because Georgia Dream has a policy posture that I agree with doesn't mean that it's right for all Georgians. And Georgia is a democracy and people are allowed to demonstrate. But if you're taking money from the United States, if you're taking money from Europe, you're not working for Georgia. You're working for governments that don't care about Georgia. Look how quickly the United States abandoned you. This Megobari Act, friendship, it's not about friendship. It's about destroying Georgia. It's about sanctioning Georgia. Europe, all those Georgians out there who dream about visa-free travel so that you can go sip latte on the banks of the River Seine. No, they've withdrawn that. You're isolated now by the people who are supposed to be your friends. Why? Because you won't commit suicide. Who is your friend? The Georgian economy today is doing pretty good. I think you had 10.4% growth in the last 2 years. It might be moving up towards 12%. Why? Because you didn't sanction Russia. You didn't jump on that economic suicide bandwagon that Europe pushed. And as a result, you have a healthy economy because of Russia. Because of Russia. Russia hasn't abandoned you and you didn't abandon Russia. So what do I think going forward? I think Georgia has to understand that if you believe in a Georgia that has the potential of Abkhazia reuniting, South Ossetia reuniting, that Georgia cannot be part of a Europe that doesn't care about that. When was the last time the Europeans fought hard to get Abkhazia back to Georgia? When was the last time the United States fought hard to get South Ossetia reunited? No, they're fighting hard so that you can join a war against Russia to help Ukraine. This coup you spoke about. There's a whole bunch of Georgians, the Georgian Legion over there in Ukraine, and they've been shipping weapons back, and they're prepared to carry out acts of violence against Georgians. These people don't care about it. I come back to my first principles. When I think of Georgia, I think of people, human beings, who have a unique culture, who have a wonderful way of life. They have family values and traditional values that I find to be very attractive, Georgian values. And the people that are in the Georgia Dream Party share these values. The people that are against Georgia Dream, by and large, don't. They don't share Georgian values. They have European values, American values that are about sacrificing Georgia. And these Georgian Legion members, they aren't pro-Georgia. They're actually anti-Georgia. Because if you want Georgians to die for Ukraine, that means you're not really thinking about what's best for Georgia. I don't know what the future holds. I think that the Georgian Dream Party is firmly in control. I think that they think strategically. And I think they understand the direction they have to go, but it has to be a direction that the Georgian people support. I don't believe Georgia Dream is going to impose anything on the people of Georgia. I think Georgia Dream will avoid being sacrificed in a war for Ukraine and continue to promote good economic relations with Russia. And if this trend continues, maybe there will be the normalization of political relations with Russia. But the Georgian people have to support that. This can't be something that is forced on the Georgian people. The Georgian people have to decide this themselves. But I would just ask anybody watching this program, many years have passed since Sukhumi fell, but it was personal for me. My father-in-law was an instructor at the Subtropical Institute right there above the Kelisuri River. And he was 62 years old when he got drafted along with others into the Sukhumi Battalion. And they were given the task of defending the Kelisuri Bridge. And when the city fell, he and his fellow academicians, 60-year-old men, held their ground. And they defended the bridge to the last round of ammunition. And then he had to go up and go across the Kadori Gorge. And if you study that history, you understand what happened there. The dead children, the elderly women who couldn't make anymore, who died, froze to death. He made that trek along with thousands of others of Georgians, and they've been forgotten. These are your citizens. These are your people. And their home is no longer their home. What are you Georgians doing about that? What are you doing about the South Ossetians, the Georgians there, tens of thousands who have been evicted from their homes? What are you doing to return them to their home? Because these are your people. These are Georgians. This is Georgia we're talking about. If you're focused on how to fight Russia for Ukraine, you're focused on the wrong thing. If you're a Georgian, you should be focused on Georgia first. What needs to be done to get South Ossetia and Abkhazia back. And it's not going to be done through force of arms. It can only be done with good, sound diplomatic relations between Russia and the Georgian Republic. You know, there's a gentleman in Moscow that I met, Mamuka Papia. He's out there doing God's work. I mean, I know he's not an official of the Georgian government, but I watch him interface with the Russians on a daily basis. This man is as pro-Georgian as you can get. He defends Georgian values. He defends Georgia, and he promotes the return of Abkhazia, the return of Ossetia, and he promotes normalized relations. These are the kind of people that the Georgian public should be embracing and should be supporting. Politics is your business. I'm American. We got enough problems here at our own at home. And I should be focused on solving this. But as I said, I have a Georgian wife. So Georgia is my problem. I do study Georgia. And I believe that Georgia needs to be on a path of peace with Russia, and that's a path that'll bring out the best for Georgia. Because if Georgia chooses the path of Europe, the path of the United States, all you're going to get is war, death, destruction. And you're never going to see a united Georgia. You're going to see a destroyed Georgia. Turkey already is talking about Ajaria, return of the Meskhetian Turks. A weak Georgia, a fractured Georgia, is a Georgia that can be picked apart by Armenians and Azerbaijanis and Turks who are waiting on the sidelines for any sign of weakness. Georgia Dream's not weak. Georgia Dream's about returning Georgia to its rightful status. And if I were a Georgian, that'd be the direction I'd be heading.
So, Mr. Ritter, thank you so much for your time and for your insights. It was really very helpful to listen to you, what you have already said about Georgia and about our circumstances, our surrounding, what we shall do, and etc. So, yes, I'm totally agree with you that we need this kind of path for our future, and hopefully this is the time with really changing world order when we can break through this circle, which we have this kind of 30 years around of our country, and the kind of trap we got our country inside. So thank you so much for this kind words.
Thank you for having me. Didi Madloba.
Didi Madloba.